The first time I saw the group managing director, I understood immediately why people spoke his name carefully. Not loudly, not casually, carefully, like a word that could change its meaning depending on who heard it. He didn't walk into the building like someone arriving. He walked like someone returning to a place that had been waiting for him. There is a difference. People who arrive adjust themselves to rooms. People who return expect rooms to adjust to them. I had read about him long before that morning. Everyone had. His profile circulated in whispers, in LinkedIn articles shared without commentary, in regulatory briefings where his name appeared without adjectives because none were sufficient. He managed 10 companies under one holding structure, most of them buried deep inside the financial sector, where consequences didn't explode immediately. They leaked, slowly, quietly, fatally. Insurance firms that decided whether loss became recovery or lifelong humiliation. Pension administrators responsible for the final dignity of people who had already given everything else away. Trustee companies guarding wealth that was never theirs but could still disappear on their watch. Investment arms that moved numbers so large they lost emotional meaning, until they ruined real lives. He was rarely present, and yet nothing significant happened without his shadow touching it. Europe 1 week, Asia the next, Africa when it mattered. His calendar was rumored to be planned 2 years ahead, yet he always appeared at the precise moment something was about to collapse, as if time itself had warned him in advance. Some men manage schedules, others manage inevitability. I was not supposed to meet him that day. Officially, my name appeared on the attendance list under support staff. That was the category reserved for people whose value had not disappeared, but whose relevance had become inconvenient. A polite shelf, a professional waiting room, a slow erasure disguised as organizational hygiene. I had once been visible. That mattered. The boardroom was too cold. Financial institutions always overdo air conditioning, as if discomfort sharpens discipline, as if money behaves better when people shiver. The table was long, polished to the point of vanity, reflective enough to show faces twice, once as they were, once as they wanted to be seen. Men and women sat around it in practiced calm. These were people who had learned to breathe steadily while hiding anxiety behind spreadsheets. People whose confidence was built on familiarity, not certainty. I took my seat near the wall. Laptop closed. Notebook open. Spine straight. Presence minimized. I had learned how to take up as little space as possible without looking defeated. Invisibility is a skill you develop when attention becomes dangerous. Then he entered. No entourage. No announcement. No performance. Just one assistant who stopped at the door while he continued forward, alone. Conversations didn't end dramatically. They simply dissolved. Words trailed off. Chairs shifted. Postures corrected themselves instinctively. Power didn't need to announce its arrival. It rearranged the room without permission. He didn't sit immediately. That mattered. He stood there for a moment, eyes moving slowly, not searching for faces, but for alignment. Not counting people, counting truths. The kind of look that didn't threaten, but unsettled because it suggested he already knew what he was about to find. His gaze passed over me once, then again, brief, measuring, not dismissive. That second look was the first fracture in the story they had built about me. People think revenge begins after humiliation. They are wrong. Mine began long before silence became my uniform. 3 years earlier, I had been visible in a way that made senior people uncomfortable. Not loud, not political, just competent enough that my work refused to hide behind others. I built models that survived audits. I wrote reports regulators quoted back to management. I flagged risks early, not dramatically, just accurately. That was my mistake. In financial institutions, brilliance is tolerated only when it flatters hierarchy. The moment it threatens comfort, it becomes something that needs management. The regional director learned this lesson long before I did. He never raised his voice, never slammed doors, never issued threats. He smiled. He praised my energy. He invited me into rooms where decisions were already made. Then, methodically, he removed my name from outcomes. A draft here finalized, without me. A presentation there delivered by someone else. My questions labeled premature. My cautions reframed as tone issues. One morning, HR sent an email. Strategic reassignment. That phrase still makes me laugh. I wasn't demoted. That would have required honesty. I was reassigned into a role with no exposure, no ownership, no trajectory. A professional cul-de-sac. I protested once, calmly, with documentation. After that, the atmosphere changed. Silence became safer. That was when I learned something institutions never admit. They don't crush people violently. They suffocate them politely. Back in the boardroom, the MD finally sat down. He aligned his notebook, straightened his pen, looked up. Let's begin. No speech, no authority performance, just 3 words. They moved through the agenda efficiently. Performance summaries, regulatory updates, expansion plans, familiar theater. Then, halfway through a slide, he interrupted. Who prepared the stress scenario for the pension liquidity buffer? The question wasn't casual. It was surgical. Glances moved. The regional director smiled lightly. It was a collaborative effort, he said. The MD didn't look at him. He looked at me. Walk me through it. No titles. No qualifiers. Just instruction. I stood. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I explained assumptions first, then stress triggers, then behavioral responses under pressure. I spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone laying evidence on a table rather than defending ego. I didn't look at the regional director. I didn't look at the room. I looked at the numbers. When I finished, he nodded once. Who signed off on it? The answer came too quickly. He wrote something down. That was when I understood something irreversible had begun. This meeting was not what they thought it was. And neither was I. Silence is a language too. People left the boardroom pretending nothing had shifted. That's the first lie power tells itself, that if no announcement is made, no change has occurred. But buildings remember. Systems remember. And so do people whose survival depends on pattern recognition. I returned to my desk without ceremony. No congratulations. No looks of sympathy. Just the familiar hum of computers and the quiet hostility of fluorescent lighting. Yet something felt different. Not lighter. Sharper. Like the air before a storm when your skin knows before your eyes do. By the time I sat down, the regional director had already started damage control. That's what men like him do best, not prevent collapse, but narrate it. Emails were sent, meetings proposed, language adjusted. He praised team contributions and shared accountability, the same way a magician distracts an audience while the real work happens elsewhere. I didn't respond to anything. Silence is a language too, and when used correctly, it unsettles people who rely on noise to feel in control. At exactly 6:17 p.m., an email arrived from the MD's office. No urgency flag. No dramatic subject line. Just a request for background material on stress testing methodologies used across subsidiaries. It was sent to 6 people, but I was the only one copied directly. That detail mattered. I didn't forward anything immediately, not because I was unsure, but because timing is leverage. I waited until the building emptied. until conversations thinned, until only people who truly worked late remained. Then I opened my archive. Most people assume erased work disappears. It doesn't. It migrates. It waits. Every model I ever built existed in multiple versions, each time-stamped, each backed up in places no one searched because no one imagined I would ever need them. Emails forwarded to myself under neutral subject lines. Drafts stored in folders named for compliance updates. Memory disguised as maintenance. I didn't collect evidence for revenge back then. I collected it for survival. Now, survival had matured. I sent exactly what was asked for. Nothing more. Nothing less. Clean. Precise. No commentary. Facts have a way of accusing without raising their voice. The reply came the next morning. Thank you. Very clear. That was all. No praise. No reassurance. Just acknowledgement. And that was far more dangerous. The follow-up session was scheduled 2 days later. Smaller group. No regional directors. No ceremonial executives. Just people who actually understood the machinery. He opened the meeting differently this time. I travel a lot, he said, folding his hands. That means I miss details unless someone insists I see them. He looked around the room. Who insists here? No one spoke. I didn't raise my hand. I placed my folder on the table. Paper still scares people more than screens. It feels permanent, uneditable. I didn't accuse anyone. Accusations invite defense. I presented contrasts. Original assumptions versus revised ones. Independent stress outcomes versus reported ones. Risk language before and after alignment. Patterns laid out gently, like a surgeon exposing tissue without tearing it. The MD asked questions. Never leading. Never rescuing. That's how I knew he already understood the destination. He was confirming the route. When the meeting ended, he thanked me again. This time by name. Pearl. Names are anchors. Once spoken by power, they hold. The shift didn't come loudly. It never does. It arrived as small behavioral changes. Colleagues who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly remembered my coffee preference. Invitations appeared. Calendars opened. I declined most of them. Attention can be a trap. The regional director avoided me. That was new. Avoidance is the first confession. The MD left the country 2 days later. Europe, then Asia. But his presence didn't leave with him. Requests came at odd hours. Clarifications. Comparisons. Historical justifications. Always copied to me. Never to the regional director. That silence grew heavy. Audits usually announce themselves loudly. This one didn't. It arrived disguised as curiosity. Why did this reserve spike here? Why was this trustee report delayed? Why did 5 subsidiaries use identical phrasing for independent reviews? Answers were provided. Explanations offered. But explanations don't erase patterns. When the MD returned, there was no town hall. No speeches. He called one meeting. I was asked to attend. So was the regional director. Halfway through, the MD looked up. Can you give us a moment? He said, gesturing to the director. Not angry. Not cold. Final. The door closed. I wasn't told what was said in that room. I didn't need to be. By the next week, the director's calendar was empty. By the next month, his role was redefined. By the next quarter, his name no longer appeared anywhere that mattered. Institutions don't punish publicly. They correct quietly. My title changed on a Wednesday afternoon. No announcement. No applause. Just access. New meetings. New approvals. New expectations. I didn't thank anyone. I got to work. Frameworks redesigned. Controls that required multiple independent validations. language that couldn't be softened without trace, reporting lines that documented intervention instead of hiding it. Revenge isn't about replacement. It's about prevention. One evening, as I packed up, he stopped by my desk. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked. I thought carefully before answering. Not because I feared him, but because truth deserves precision. Because systems remember, I said finally, even when people pretend not to. He smiled. Not approval. Recognition. Fear didn't disappear. It migrated. Meetings became honest. Reports became accurate. Silence stopped being weaponized. People worked better when truth was allowed to breathe. It wasn't the director's exit. It wasn't my promotion. It was this. My name stayed on my work. They thought I had gone quiet because I was weak. They were wrong. I was listening. And institutions, when guided correctly, listen back. When visibility becomes a weapon, power does not announce itself with promotions. It announces itself with access. My access changed first. Calendars that had once been sealed, like vaults, began to open. Meeting invitations arrived without context, without hierarchy, without apology. I was no longer added at the end of email chains. I was placed at the beginning, quietly, deliberately, as if someone wanted to see what would happen when truth entered rooms before politics had time to arrange the furniture. People noticed, not admiration, calculation. They watched the way I listened, the way I didn't rush to speak, the way I didn't soften language for comfort. They wanted to know if I would become what had almost destroyed me, if power would make me loud, vindictive, reckless. That was the next test. I stayed boring, precise, predictable in ethics, unpredictable in insight. It unsettled them more than anger ever could. A cross-company governance committee was proposed. 10 subsidiaries, 10 cultures, 10 different ways of hiding small sins inside large systems. My name surfaced during nominations. It was challenged immediately. She's too quiet. She lacks political experience. She hasn't traveled enough. The usual objections. The kind that sound reasonable until you examine what they protect. The MD listened without interruption. Then he said, "That's exactly why she's right." The room adjusted again. My first international assignment wasn't glamorous. No champagne, no photographs, no announcements, just a middle seat and a mandate. Review governance alignment in 2 subsidiaries. Report inconsistencies. Recommend changes. No escorts. No ceremonies. Anonymity was intentional. I arrived as a function, not a figure. Different city. Same tricks. Numbers moved just enough to feel safe. Language softened just enough to avoid alarm. Responsibility passed sideways until no one held it long enough to be accountable. People smiled. People explained. People reassured. I documented, not emotionally, systematically. 30 pages. No adjectives. No blame. Just facts arranged so tightly denial would have to work overtime. The MD replied with one word. Implement. No debate. No politics. That's when resistance began. Not as refusal, as delay. Calendars filled. Clarifications multiplied. Questions circled. I didn't push. I recorded. Time reveals intent. Once approvals were granted, I stopped asking. I executed. Policies updated. Controls enforced. Reporting lines rerouted. Every action logged. Transparency terrifies manipulators because it removes their favorite hiding place, ambiguity. They started calling me difficult. I smiled. That word had tried to kill my career once. Now it protected my work. He traveled more, stayed out of meetings, let systems speak. That was deliberate governance that only works under supervision isn't governance. It's fear. Then pressure arrived. Claims rose quietly. Pension withdrawals accelerated. Trustee clients started asking questions they hadn't asked before, and at the right time. This wasn't coincidence. This was stress testing reality. Shortcuts surfaced quickly. A reporting anomaly, a pattern others might have ignored. We caught it early. Millions saved. Reputation preserved. No headlines. That was the victory. Regulators noticed. They didn't praise often. This one did. Improved transparency and accountability across group entities. They didn't name me. They didn't need to. Power is not free. Friends stopped inviting me out. Jokes died when I entered rooms. Conversations paused. Loneliness arrived quietly and stayed. I accepted it. She came to my desk one evening. "They keep changing my work," she said. "I think I'm invisible." I looked at her carefully. I saw myself 3 years earlier. "No," I said, "you're being tested." I showed her how to save versions, how to track changes, how to let history speak later when voices fail. History repeats unless interrupted. The MD announced his transition quietly. Advisory role, less travel, more distance. The system would stand alone now. That was the point. "What happens if you leave?" he asked me once. "It won't matter," I replied. That's when he knew. Revenge wasn't a position. It wasn't a title. It wasn't even recognition. It was a structure that couldn't forget the truth, even if it wanted to. My title changed again. This time it was announced. Applause followed. I wasn't there. I was working. They remembered me now. Every single one. The regional director crossed my mind once. Just once. Then I archived him. It wasn't destruction. It was accuracy. Intensity rises next. Systems under fire. The moment where correction becomes confrontation, and Pearl chooses risk over safety. Pressure does not ask permission. Intensity doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives pretending to be routine. The first signal was small enough to be dismissed by anyone who wanted peace more than truth. A marginal spike in claims frequency. A slight acceleration in pension withdrawals. Trustee clients asking questions that sounded innocent, but landed too precisely to be coincidence. Nothing was broken yet. That was what made it dangerous. Systems fail loudly only at the end. Before that, they whisper. I had learned to listen to whispers. Executives who had grown comfortable under the new controls started shifting in their seats. Not because they were guilty, but because they were exposed. Numbers no longer bent easily. Language no longer absorbed consequences. For the first time, truth moved faster than excuses. That terrified them. They didn't challenge me directly. That would have required courage. They questioned timelines instead. They spoke of operational drag. They warned that I was slowing growth. Old tactics, new desperation. I let them speak. During a routine review, I found it. A legacy account. High value. Politically sensitive. Structurally rotten. It had survived for years because it lived in a space between responsibility and assumption. Everyone thought someone else owned it. Everyone was wrong. I didn't close the file. I opened it fully. The exposure wasn't small. It wasn't manageable. If mishandled, it could destroy reputations, trigger regulatory scrutiny, and end careers, including mine. This was the moment revenge turns into responsibility. I didn't panic. Panic clouds judgment. I escalated. Emergency session. No filters. No buffers. No regional insulation. Just facts laid out without emotional anesthesia. I spoke slower than usual, letting each implication settle before moving to the next. Silence followed. Not respectful silence. Fearful silence. One board member leaned back, arms crossed. "You're overreaching," he said. "This is beyond your mandate." I met his eyes. "Integrity doesn't recognize mandates," I replied. The room inhaled sharply. He didn't like that, but he didn't interrupt again. The MD didn't defend me. He did something far more effective. He asked the board member a question so precise, so anchored in documented reality, that no answer could survive it. That ended the debate. They wanted containment. I demanded correction. Containment preserves reputation. Correction preserves institutions. They chose correction. Weeks blurred into nights. My body functioned on discipline alone. Sleep became optional. Hunger irrelevant. I stopped being liked. I started being trusted. There is a difference. We fixed it before it surfaced. No leaks. No headlines. No scandal to satisfy the public's hunger for villains. Careers ended quietly. Contracts dissolved silently. Structures reset permanently. No names named. Just accountability enforced. This is what governance looks like when it's real. Not during applause. Not during promotions. But when someone says, "We can't do that anymore," Pearl will catch it. Fear had changed sides. She came back to my office weeks later. "They stopped changing my work," she said. I nodded. "Good," I replied. "Now keep records anyway." Pressure returned months later. This time, nothing broke. Processes held. Controls worked. People complied. Revenge had matured into stability. Relationships failed. Invitations vanished. Time collapsed into obligation. Loneliness became familiar. But when I looked in the mirror, I recognized myself. That mattered more than comfort. An email arrived from an airport lounge somewhere in the world. "You built something I couldn't." It read, "Enjoy the silence." I did. The woman I became, I was no longer erased, no longer reacting, no longer waiting. I had become architecture. People didn't ask who I was anymore. They asked how things worked. They didn't flatter. They complied. That is the final form of power. The last thing they learned was this: revenge doesn't always destroy people. Sometimes it makes destruction unnecessary. I didn't outshout them. I outlasted them. I didn't expose them publicly. I made exposure impossible to repeat. This was never about a man who traveled the world. It was about a woman who made sure the system remembered the truth. When the system pushes back, stability irritates people who profit from disorder. The moment things stopped breaking, resistance became smarter. Not louder, smarter. It hid inside procedure. It wore the language of compliance. It learned to quote policy without understanding purpose. That's when I knew the system was testing me back. It started with small distortions. Requests routed around governance under the excuse of urgency. Decisions framed as temporary exceptions. Emails that excluded me but referenced my framework like a shield. They weren't trying to dismantle what I built. They were trying to hollow it out. Slowly, I called it what it was: erosion. And erosion, if left alone, always wins. I didn't confront individuals. Individuals turn into martyrs. I confronted patterns. I tracked deviation frequency, mapped exception clusters, compared urgency claims to actual outcomes. Numbers don't argue. They testify. The results were clean. Too clean to ignore. I introduced a change that looked insignificant on paper. A requirement for post-action justification on all exceptions, logged automatically, reviewed quarterly. No punishment attached. No drama. Just memory. People hate memory when they rely on forgetting. Within weeks, exception requests dropped. Not because urgency vanished, but because accountability had arrived. They called it bureaucracy. I called it gravity. Then the call came. Regulatory liaison. Tight voice. Carefully neutral. "We need clarity," she said. "There's concern you're centralizing too much authority." I smiled to myself. Authority had nothing to do with it. Visibility did. "I'm not centralizing authority," I replied. "I'm decentralizing responsibility." Silence on the line. That distinction matters. Only one of them survives: scrutiny. The inquiry never became formal. It didn't need to. The regulators already had what they wanted: consistency, traceability, proof that no single person could bend the system quietly anymore. That included me. That was intentional. Power that exempts itself always rots. Inside the group, whispers shifted tone. I was no longer called difficult. I was called inflexible. That word made me dangerous. Inflexibility, when attached to principle, scares people who rely on negotiation to escape consequence. A senior executive cornered me after a meeting. Smile sharp, voice low. "You're boxing people in," he said. "You're removing discretion." "No," I replied. "I'm documenting it." He didn't smile back. That was the moment he realized persuasion wouldn't work. Pressure escalated. Deadlines compressed. Requests multiplied. Everyone was suddenly urgent. Everyone needed exceptions for strategic reasons. I let the system answer. Most requests died quietly once they realized no one would forget them later. A few survived. Those few were real. That's how you know the difference between manipulation and necessity, when accountability doesn't scare it away. Late one night, alone in the office, I reviewed a dashboard I had built months earlier. Predictive stress markers, behavioral deviations, escalation velocity. Everything was green. Not perfect. Honest. That was the goal. I leaned back and felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not comfort. Peace. The kind that comes when you know collapse won't be blamed on silence anymore. The kind that comes when revenge no longer needs emotion to sustain it. The cost one warned me about. They tell you power isolates. They don't tell you how quietly. No dramatic exits. No confrontations. Just absence. Messages unanswered. Invitations forgotten. Colleagues who once lingered now passed by with professional efficiency. I became a function, not a friend. That was the price. I paid it willingly, but isolation has a way of amplifying thought. At night, when work slowed and noise faded, old questions resurfaced. Was this what I wanted? Had I replaced erasure with armor so thick nothing human could pass through? The answer came unexpectedly. A junior analyst requested time on my calendar. Nervous, precise, overprepared. She sat down and placed her notebook between us like an offering. "I think something's wrong," she said, and I don't know how to say it without sounding dramatic. I listened. She was right. Not catastrophically. Not yet. But she saw what others missed. And more importantly, she felt safe enough to say it. That was the proof. Systems don't protect themselves. People do when they're allowed to speak without fear. I guided her through escalation, not shielding, not rescuing, teaching. When she left, she stood straighter. I stayed seated longer than usual. Revenge had started as survival. It had become stewardship. That transformation mattered. When time stops belonging to them, the man who once owned time had given it back to the system. That was his final act of power. He didn't interfere. He didn't advise. He watched from distance as something outlived his presence. That's how legacies are measured, not by how loudly they're remembered, but by how little they're needed. The organization no longer waited for approval from the top. It relied on structure, on process, on truth that didn't flinch under pressure. And I stopped counting hours. When your work stops leaking anxiety, time loosens its grip. I walked out of the building one evening as the lights flickered off behind me. No applause, no announcement, just quiet continuity. They didn't fear me anymore. They respected the system. That was better. The storm that did not ask for permission. Every system is eventually tested by something it did not plan for. Not a weakness, not a loophole, a shock. It came disguised as macroeconomics, currency pressure, policy shifts, global volatility that made even seasoned analysts uncomfortable. The kind of instability that turns long-term promises into immediate liabilities. Insurance claims surged again, this time not quietly. Pension funds felt strain not from withdrawals, but from valuation uncertainty. Trustee clients began asking questions that were no longer polite. This wasn't internal rot. This was the world knocking. Emergency committees formed. War rooms reopened. Old instincts resurfaced. Centralize, override, rush. People looked for voices they trusted under pressure. They didn't look for me. They looked for the framework. That was the difference. Dashboards lit up. Early warning systems triggered exactly as designed. No panic indicators. Just escalation pathways activating in sequence. People followed them because they had practiced following them. Fear didn't paralyze. It organized. In one meeting, a senior executive said it out loud without realizing the weight of it. "We don't need improvisation," he said. "We need to stick to Pearl's structure." No one corrected him. I didn't react. Architecture doesn't need applause. Decisions were slower than panic wanted, but faster than collapse required. Exposure was isolated. Liquidity buffers held. Communication was honest without being theatrical. The market punished noise. It spared discipline. When the worst passed, regulators requested briefings. Not investigations. Briefings. That distinction meant everything. They asked how we anticipated pressure points, how escalation avoided distortion, how accountability remained intact under stress. We showed them. No hero stories, no last-minute rescues, just evidence that systems had behaved the way systems should. One of them looked up and said, "This is rare." I nodded. Rarity is not magic. It's maintenance. The mirror no one talks about. After the storm, quiet returned. Not relief. Reflection. That's when the mirror appears. The one power never warns you about. The one that asks who you became while fixing what was broken. I walked through departments unnoticed. People worked, spoke freely, escalated concerns without flinching. They didn't check over their shoulders. That was the proof. And yet, something felt unfinished. I hadn't lost myself, but I had compressed myself. Emotions stored neatly away like files marked non-critical. There is a cost to that kind of control. I took a day off. Not announced. Not justified. Just gone. I walked without purpose. No calls. No dashboards. No urgency. Time felt unfamiliar when it wasn't owned by responsibility. That's when I realized something quietly dangerous. I no longer knew how to rest without permission. Power had rewired me. That night, I wrote something I had not written in years. Not a report, not a framework. A letter. Not to anyone else. To myself. It didn't accuse. It didn't praise. It reminded me why I noticed patterns in the first place. Why silence once hurt. Why truth mattered enough to defend even when it costs belonging. I slept without setting an alarm. Institutions don't fail at the top. They fail at transition. When leadership changes, systems either hold or reveal how much depended on personalities pretending to be principals. The announcement came without drama. New executive leadership, different style, same mandate. I was invited into the transition process. I declined a central role. That shocked them. Why, one asked, because if it needs me, I replied, it's not finished. I stayed available, not visible, observing how decisions were made without my presence, where hesitation appeared, where confidence remained. There were missteps, small ones, correctable ones. That mattered. A system that never stumbles has learned nothing. A system that recovers without panic has learned enough. Months passed. Nothing broke. That was the victory no one clapped for. I met him once more. Not in an office. Not in a boardroom. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere human. You were never supposed to be quiet forever, he said. I wasn't, I replied. I was supposed to be heard once. He nodded. You changed how this place thinks about risk. No, I said. I changed how it remembers it. He smiled. That recognition was the final transaction between us. Balanced. I still work. I still watch patterns. But I no longer carry the weight alone. People escalate without fear. Junior voices surface early. Silence is no longer mistaken for loyalty. My name appears less. That's intentional. Power that insists on being seen hasn't finished its work. I am no longer erased. I am no longer reacting. I am no longer waiting. I am continuity. They thought revenge would look like exposure. They thought it would be loud. They were wrong. Revenge looked like a system that refused to forget the truth, even when forgetting was convenient. I didn't destroy them. I made them unnecessary. Power doesn't announce when it starts taking something from you. It subtracts quietly, after the storm, after the stability, after the recognition that never needed to be spoken. Something in me resisted rest. Not fear, not ambition. A restlessness that felt like standing guard long after the threat had passed. I reviewed dashboards that no longer required my attention. I reread reports that were already sound. I checked escalation logs that had become boring. Boring was success. And yet, boredom felt like grief. Because for years, vigilance had been my language of survival. Without it, silence felt too wide. Too open, like a room with no walls. One evening, I caught myself rewriting a document that didn't need rewriting. The changes were cosmetic, pointless, control pretending to be care. I stopped. That was the first honest pause I'd allowed myself in years. I realized something then that no framework had prepared me for. When revenge matures into stability, it leaves behind a hollow space where anger used to live. And that space demands to be filled with something else. Purpose alone is not enough. It must evolve, or it turns inward. I hadn't thought about who I was before the suffocation. Not in detail. Survival doesn't leave room for nostalgia. But memory doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. I remembered my first year in the institution. How I stayed late not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. How numbers excited me. How patterns felt like puzzles, not weapons. How I believed excellence would naturally be rewarded. That version of me had not been foolish. She had been untested. I hadn't killed her. I had armored her. The question was whether I still knew how to take the armor off. A different kind of threat. The next challenge didn't come from markets or executives or regulators. It came from success. Other organizations began asking questions. Not officially, informally. How did we redesign governance without collapse? How did we enforce accountability without paralyzing decision-making? How did we stop personalities from hijacking systems? They wanted the blueprint. They wanted me. That was dangerous. Systems fail when they become exportable without context. What we had built worked because it grew from pain, from memory, from scars. Detached from that, it could become another checklist, another illusion. I refused most invitations, not because I didn't care, but because I did. I accepted one. Carefully, speaking without permission. The room was not mine. Neutral city, neutral stage, neutral faces, executives from institutions that had never been forced to confront themselves honestly. They expected strategy. I gave them consequences. I spoke about what it costs to fix systems after they have learned how to hide, about how power resists memory, about how governance fails, not because people are evil, but because they are comfortable. The room shifted. Someone asked, "What's the first step?" I answered without hesitation, "Stop rewarding silence." They wrote it down. Some understood. Some didn't. That was not my responsibility. When I left the stage, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had been heard, but because I had spoken without needing the outcome, letting go without collapse. Back home, I made a decision that would have terrified the woman I once was. I delegated something critical, not because I was tired, because I trusted the system. It worked. Nothing broke. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. The final misconception, people still tell the story wrong. They say I was saved by a powerful man. They say opportunity finally noticed me. They say I was lucky. Luck is when someone sees you. What they never say is that I stayed long enough to be undeniable, that I learned the system's language better than those who abused it, that I chose patience over spectacle. Revenge wasn't an act. It was a refusal to disappear. What time finally taught me, the man who once owned time taught me something without intending to. Time does not belong to those who travel endlessly or control calendars. It belongs to those who build things that endure without supervision. I no longer measure my days by urgency. I measure them by resilience. If I disappear tomorrow, the system will still remember the truth. That was always the point. They thought I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted permanence. They thought I wanted revenge. I wanted accuracy. They thought silence meant defeat. I was listening. And now there is nothing left to prove. The rival who spoke fluently in chaos. Every stable system eventually attracts someone who believes they are smarter than it. He arrived quietly, not announced as a threat, introduced as an asset, decorated resume. International pedigree, the kind of executive who spoke in complete sentences and unfinished intentions. He smiled often, too often, as if confidence were a performance that needed constant rehearsal. He understood numbers, but more importantly, he understood people. Where others tested the system with urgency, he tested it with charm. His proposals were elegant, efficient, always framed as optimization, never opposition. He praised the governance framework publicly while bending around it privately. Small exceptions, pilot projects, strategic carve-outs, nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just enough flexibility to remind people how things used to feel before accountability became unavoidable. That's how Rot returns, nostalgically. I noticed him the way you notice a change in pressure before a storm. Subtle, behavioral. People laughed more in meetings he attended. Decisions accelerated without documentation. Language softened again. He wasn't breaking rules. He was teaching people how to forget why the rules existed. When intuition becomes evidence, I didn't confront him. Confrontation feeds men like him. It gives them a stage. I watched. Patterns emerged slowly. His initiatives clustered around areas with historical weakness. His efficiencies bypassed post-action justification. His emails praised transparency while routing decisions offline. He didn't remove controls. He distracted from them. That was more dangerous. I built a quiet overlay. Behavioral analytics applied, not to numbers, but to decisions. Approval velocity, exception density, language drift. It took weeks. It took patience. The result was unmistakable. Where he touched, memory thinned. That was the signature. The conversation he didn't expect. I invited him to coffee. Neutral ground. Public space. No witnesses that mattered. You've done impressive work, I said. He smiled, relieved. Thank you. I'm trying to respect what you built. I know, I replied. That's why I wanted to talk. He leaned in, interested now. You're very good at making people comfortable. I continued. But this system was built to survive discomfort. His smile paused, just for a fraction of a second. I think you misunderstand my intentions, he said smoothly. I don't, I replied. I understand your methods. Silence. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I explained consequences. Not personally, structurally. I showed him what the overlay revealed. Not all of it, just enough. For the first time, his charm failed him. What do you want? He asked. Alignment, I said, or distance. He chose alignment publicly, distance privately. That told me everything. When charm meets memory, he adjusted, became careful, slower, more compliant, too compliant. People like him don't change. They retreat. Weeks later, a proposal surfaced from another department. Different name, same structure, same bypasses, same language drift. Proxy. I escalated. This time, I didn't go alone. The system responded the way it had been trained to respond. Not with outrage, with verification, with traceability, with quiet refusal. The proposal died, without drama. So did his influence. He left 6 months later. For new opportunities. No scandal. No announcement. Just absence. That was the system working. The cost of always being right. Victory is rarely satisfying when it comes too often. I had protected the system again, but something in me felt heavier, not because of the fight, but because of the vigilance it required. I wondered how long a person could remain a living safeguard without becoming a prison for themselves. That question followed me home. I began saying no, not to work, but to excess. I stopped attending meetings where my presence added reassurance, but not value. I forced others to carry weight I could have lifted easily. The system groaned, then adapted. That was the lesson repeated. Growth hurts first. Love, untrained. He wasn't part of the institution. That was why he survived proximity to me. We met without context, without titles, without urgency. He didn't ask what I did. He asked how I rested. That question disarmed me more than any boardroom ever had. I didn't answer honestly at first. I didn't know how. Time with him was inefficient, unscheduled, unproductive, and somehow essential. He noticed when I dissociated, when my attention drifted toward invisible dashboards. He didn't challenge it. He waited. Love, I learned, is the opposite of governance. It doesn't scale. It doesn't document. It doesn't justify itself. It simply insists. A minor issue surfaced, contained, manageable, the kind I would once have handled personally. I didn't. I watched others respond. Hesitation, discussion, action. They fixed it. Not perfectly, but honestly, that was enough. I went home early that day. Years pass differently when systems hold. Crises shrink. Drama fades. Competence becomes boring again. That's success. New hires don't know my story. They don't need to. They inherit the result, not the struggle. Sometimes I walk past a meeting room and hear someone say, "That won't pass review." They don't say my name anymore. That is the highest compliment. I am older now, not tired, not finished, just complete. The man who once owned time fades into memory. The rival dissolves into irrelevance. The institution continues without noticing the absence of its scaffolding. I sit in the quiet and feel no urgency to correct it. The system remembers. That was always enough. Revenge did not make me loud. It made me precise. It did not give me enemies. It made me unnecessary. They thought I wanted justice. I wanted permanence. I didn't win by standing above them. I won by building something that stood without me. And this is what happens when truth is given time to outlive power. When the ground remembers your footsteps, long after I stepped away from daily command, the building still reacted to my presence. Not formally. No titles followed me down the hall. No assistants rushed ahead. But conversations slowed when I passed. Decisions sharpened. People straightened papers that didn't need straightening. Not out of fear. Out of habit. Systems remember their architects the way land remembers rivers that once cut through it. Even when dry, the path remains. I never corrected them. Correction would have made me relevant again. The young woman who asked the wrong question. She caught me near the elevators one evening. New hire. Sharp eyes. Too honest for her own safety. Why did you build it this way? She asked. Not how. Why? I looked at her for a long moment, measured her weight against the system's tolerance. Because people don't fail first. I said, they drift. She frowned. So this is about control. No, I replied. It's about memory. She didn't understand yet, but she would. A test I never designed. The first real test came after my departure. External pressure. Political. Financial. Loud. The kind that used to force shortcuts. The kind that once broke institutions, quietly while everyone clapped publicly. I watched from a distance, not as a guardian, as a witness. The system resisted. Not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently. Requests were logged, deviations justified, exceptions documented instead of celebrated. The pressure moved elsewhere. That's how you know something is alive. Predators avoid what won't forget them. Love does not ask for reports. He asked me once if I missed it. The power, the relevance, the quiet authority that bent rooms. I thought about it longer than I should have. No, I said, I missed the clarity, not the cost. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he just accepted. Love doesn't interrogate answers. It trusts the pause before them. Not everyone faded peacefully. Some men carried my name like a bruise. They spoke it rarely, but when they did, it came with qualifiers. She was difficult. She was inflexible. She didn't understand how things really work. They aged badly. Systems moved on without them. That was the cruelty they never anticipated. Irrelevance without confrontation. I didn't ruin their lives. I simply refused to carry them. One afternoon, years later, I was invited to review a digitization project. Legacy records, old frameworks, historical annotations. Buried deep in the archive was my handwriting, not my name, my logic. Someone had preserved the reasoning behind the earliest controls, not as rules, but as narrative, why each safeguard existed, who it protected, what it had already survived. I felt something loosen in my chest. They didn't just inherit the structure. They inherited the story. The hardest transition wasn't leaving. It was realizing the story no longer required me. Events unfolded. Decisions were made. Failures corrected. Successes absorbed. No one called. No one should have. I learned how to be a reader of a book I once wrote, that humility took longer than any negotiation ever had. A quiet evening, and no urgency. We sat on the balcony. The city below us moved like a system of its own, imperfect, loud, resilient. He poured wine. I didn't check my phone. For the first time in decades, nothing waited for me. That absence felt earned. Legacy isn't memory. It's behavior that persists without applause. It's the meeting that ends early because no one wants to cut corners. It's the junior analyst who asks for documentation without being told. It's the decision that I didn't need a statue. I needed continuity. Revenge has a final form. It is this. They never speak your name when they do the right thing because the right thing has become automatic. I didn't outshout them. I outlasted them. I didn't burn the house down. I made it fireproof. And long after I am silent, the system will still remember how to stand. The world that forgot the fire, the danger didn't arrive as corruption. It arrived as comfort. A new generation took over, brilliant, educated, ethical by instinct. They inherited stability the way children inherit language, unaware of how easily it can be lost. They asked fewer questions about why things were built the way they were, not out of arrogance, out of trust. Trust is beautiful. Trust is fragile. I watched from the outside as policies were simplified, language modernized, friction reduced, not removed, just softened. Efficiency always sounds like progress when memory fades. The enemy with a clean face, this one didn't sneak. She was invited, young, global, celebrated. Her reputation preceded her like applause that never stopped. She spoke of innovation the way priests speak of salvation. She promised agility, relevance, speed. Boards love speed when they no longer remember crashes. She never attacked the system. She reframed it. Outdated, overcautious, designed for a different era. She wasn't wrong. That's what made her dangerous. It started subtly, a footnote in a report, a reference in a meeting. According to the Pearl framework, legacy controls originating from Pearl era governance, era. I laughed when I heard that word. Eras end. Truth doesn't. Someone reached out. Not officially. Not desperately. Carefully. They didn't ask me to return. They asked me to explain. That was new. I joined the meeting remotely. Camera off. Voice only. They presented the proposed overhaul. Sleek. Intelligent. Mathematically sound. Then I asked one question. What problem are you solving that hasn't already tried to destroy us once? Silence. Not offense. Uncertainty. The innovator answered smoothly. Risk has evolved. Yes, I said, but human behavior hasn't. She smiled. That's a cynical view. No, I replied. It's an experienced one. Memory is not resistance. I didn't argue. I narrated. I told them about the near collapse no one documented publicly, about the deals that looked brilliant until they weren't, about the men who smiled as they signed papers that would have ended everything. I told them why each safeguard existed, not as nostalgia, as anatomy. You don't remove bones because the body has learned to stand. They voted anyway, not unanimously, not recklessly, but decisively. The world belongs to the living, not its architects. I respected that. The new framework launched. Cleaner, faster, lighter. For a while, it worked. That's how it always starts. The failure wasn't dramatic. No headlines, no arrests, just a small exception approved too quickly, a partner trusted too deeply, a clause interpreted creatively. The loss was contained, but the pattern was familiar. Someone noticed. They froze the rollout. They pulled the archive. They found my handwriting again. The message I didn't send. I drafted an email, then deleted it. They didn't need me to say, I told you so. They needed space to remember for themselves. That restraint was harder than intervention had ever been. When they fixed it without me, they restored parts of the old system. Not all of it, just the pieces that mattered. They added new safeguards, their own language, their own logic. They didn't resurrect my work. They evolved it. I cried that night, quietly, without shame. That was the handoff. The final truth: power fades, revenge cools, even legacy dissolves. But responsibility, when taught instead of enforced, mutates into instinct. That was always the end game. Not to be remembered, not to be praised, not even to be right forever, but to teach the system how to correct itself when no one is watching. The innovator after the applause, she didn't resign. That surprised everyone. Most people disappear when their ideas fracture. She stayed, sat through reviews, asked questions she once answered too quickly, listened longer than she spoke. In private, she requested the archive. Not summaries, not highlights, everything. She read it like a confession that wasn't hers, but could have been. That was the moment I stopped seeing her as an enemy. She wasn't reckless. She was early. When humility becomes intelligence, she reached out. Directly this time. I thought memory was fear. She said, I was wrong. I didn't soften my reply. I didn't sharpen it either. Memory isn't fear, I said. It's scar tissue. It tells you where not to bleed again. There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. I wish you'd been louder, she said. No, I replied. You wouldn't have heard me. She understood that too. The cost I never billed. There were nights I didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from habit. Years of vigilance had wired my body to scan for danger even when none existed. Silence felt suspicious. Peace felt temporary. He noticed before I did. You're not on duty anymore, he said gently. I know, I replied. But knowing and releasing are not the same. I had built a system that learned how to rest. I had not. What power takes that it never returns? People talk about burnout like it's exhaustion. It isn't. It's identity erosion. When your usefulness becomes your language, silence feels like illiteracy. When your absence doesn't collapse the world, you wonder what you were for. I never said this out loud. I wrote it down instead. Pages no one would audit. Sentences without frameworks. That was my last unstructured system. The letter I left unsent. I wrote to the younger version of myself, the one who still believed competence guaranteed safety. I told her this. You will be punished for being precise. You will be called difficult for being consistent. You will survive by refusing to become loud. And one day, you will sit in quiet and miss the fight, not because you loved it, but because it proved you mattered. Then I folded the letter and burned it. Some truths don't need witnesses. When the system faced something new, the threat wasn't corruption. It was automation, decision-making delegated to machines trained on historical data, including my era. Models optimized outcomes without understanding intention, speed without conscience, pattern without pause. The system hesitated, not because it lacked technology, because it lacked philosophy. That's when the archive was reopened again, not for controls, but for reasoning. I was invited, not as authority, but as context. That felt right. Teaching a machine about memory, I spoke to engineers, not executives. I didn't tell them what to build. I told them what had almost destroyed us. I explained why some inefficiencies were deliberate, why friction saved lives, why speed without reflection repeats history faster. They listened like builders, not disruptors. They encoded caution. That may have been my strangest victory. The day I finally slept, no dreams, no alerts, No phantom meetings unfolding behind my eyes. Just rest. I woke up late. Sunlight on the wall. Coffee already made. For the first time, I wasn't needed anywhere. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. Years from now, Pearl won't be a person. She'll be a principle. A line in training. A cautionary tale. A footnote. A framework attributed to legacy governance. That's how stories survive institutions. They lose faces. They keep meaning. The end, that isn't an end. If you're listening to this, you're already inside the system. You benefit from choices you didn't witness, safeguards you didn't demand, memory you didn't earn. Honor it, not by preserving it unchanged, but by remembering why it existed when you choose to evolve it. I am Pearl. I built something that learned how to outgrow me, and that was the only ending worth writing. If this story resonated with you, like it, share it with someone who understands quiet strength, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because the most dangerous lessons are the ones we forget we were taught.